Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Dr. Dina Al-Thani. I'm a faculty member in the College of Science and Engineering, and today we are here with you to present a fundamental topic in the area of human-computer interaction, which is user interface design and evaluation. And in fact, this topic is highly covered in the field of HCI, which is human-computer interaction, and it's an important fundamental, it provides an important fundamental understanding of this area. This lecture today is delivered by faculty member and researchers in the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Hamad bin Khalifa University is part or a member of Qatar Foundation. The aim of or the goal of initiating a homegrown research-based university is to become a catalyst for transformation in Qatar and the region, as well with a global impact. We aim at HBKU to fulfill QF vision in unlocking the human potential. So as I said today, the lecture will be on user interface design and evaluation. I will start by explaining part of design. My name, as I said, Dr. Dina Al-Thani. My interests are in web accessibility, human-computer interaction, and assistive technology, and I also look at areas of e-health and health informatics. My colleague, Dr. Kamran Khawaja, is a postdoctoral researcher at the College of Science and Engineering. He has a similar background as mine, and he looked at areas including human-computer interaction, assistive technology, and he focused on the area of autism and human-computer interaction. So as I said, the topic today is in user interface design and evaluation. We will divide the lecture in two parts. The first part will cover the design area, and the second part will cover the evaluation area. So the design and evaluation disciplines of human-computer interaction started to gain focus in the early 80s. However, the user-centered design has started to gain focus within the 90s and the decades later. This approach focuses on the user-centered. And what do we mean by the user-centered? So the user is the main goal of any activity within this model. And here I'm using the famous double diamond model for design developed by the British Design Council, which define the process of design in a very clear way. So it describes the process of design by starting with discovering the problem. So we have a problem at hand, and we would like to discover the problem as a designer and software engineers. So we start by discovering a problem. So we go and look at the literature, maybe interview people to know what exactly is the problem and to create a broad understanding of the problem. Following that, we look at defining the problem. So with defining the problem, we mean is basically describing what exactly is the problem is, how can we solve it, what are the options of solving it, and that, of course, also happen with the presence of the users. The next step becomes we have at this stage we have basically completed the first part of the diamond in front of us, which is discover and define. So at this stage, we are in a very important milestone, which is defining the problem. What do we mean by defining the problem? It's actually explaining all the attributes that affects the problem at hand, the users themselves, whom are our users, whom are our stakeholders, who is related to the system, but they might not be using the system. So at that stage, the problem is clearly defined for us, and we start with the process of development. At this process, we may develop a number of solutions. It could not be only one solution. At this process, It's our chance to test the different solutions with the users and the stakeholders. So at this time, we look at different solutions, different prototypes, and we keep testing them with the user. And that's why we call it a user-centric design approach, where the user is involved in each and every stage. The final stage is delivering the product. Again, we will evaluate this final product with our users, with our stakeholder, to reaching in an agreement with the user, stakeholder, and us as designer of a common understanding of the problem, a common understanding of the system we have developed and how it works. So that's in a nutshell what is user-centered design is. I will focus in the part of basically developing and defining. So the two parts in the middle of the diamond, and then my colleague, Dr. Kamran, will be focusing on the second two part, which is the development as well and the delivering. So the design process is actually a very interesting process, and it evolved with years, and we will come across today with some of the ideas, the new ideas in design and new approach, some framework. And however, I will start the initial slides with basically introducing to you the fundamentals of design in human-computer interaction, the main terminologies we used, and then toward the last two slides of my presentation, I will introduce to you some new framework that maybe you would be interested in and could go and look more about how this framework work, and maybe read about it and maybe use it in your work practice or in your research. So what is design? Design, the terminology design differ from one discipline to another. In our discipline, which is human-computer interaction, we define it as the art of facilitating interaction between the human through services and products. So it is basically how we as human interact with a medium in between, which is the device or the product or the platform. So it could be the social media platform, it could be a product we are using. So how we as a human interact together with this medium in between. When looking at design in the early stages of this area and these disciplines, in maybe the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, people came up with design principles. Why do we need design principles? Actually, design principles, they are generalized abstraction used by us as a designer to aid our thinking when we design a user interaction or a user experience. So we need them just as a guidance or a very high level abstract guidance toward the design. However, what is centric to this process is the human itself. So you cannot design an object or a platform or a software without the involvement of the human as in the main centric user. And that's what I believe, and that's what in the school of thoughts that I believe in, that user-centric design is extremely important, and we cannot design any object without the involvement of its intended user. Otherwise, we will fall in a series of failures that we could have avoided if we included the target user from the very early stages. And that's what I actually do in my research. In the project I work on, I usually always involve the students or the main users in the initial part, even though that there are a long list of design principles available to design for specific. For example, we work a lot with autism. So even though that there are a lot of design principles when it comes to autism, it is important for me to involve the teacher, the parents, and the child when I design a product to a specific target, for me to understand their real needs. Another common terminology in the field of design is user journey. A user journey helps designers, stakeholders to basically discuss the user experience, find some issues, failures, or opportunities in this design journey. And it is actually a visualization of the process that the person go through from one stage to another, and actually it focuses on the goal, on the final goals. What do you want to perform in a certain task? You want to, for example, create a website, and you want to develop an application that help people create a website. So you have this target goal in the end. So you need to design the user journey from once the user intend to design an object until the object is basically fully designed and operating. Prototyping is actually a way for us to show our idea during the design process. So we have a lot, at the design stage, we would have many ideas in mind. However, we need to materialize these ideas to show people an actual model of this idea for us to communicate, discuss, find issues, and define our intentions from design. So a prototype is basically a simple experimental model that is used for the purpose of validating ideas, design assumptions, and other aspects within the process, and it helps us communicate our ideas, in fact. Last terminology I will be covering today is participatory design. Participatory design is a new framework in the area of design and human interaction. However, the fundamental theory behind it has been there since the 70s, and it had actually a political background behind it. Before this idea becomes a computer science, human-computer interaction framework, it had a political background that I will be explaining, inshallah, during this session. So participatory design basically means that if you want to have a successful design, you need to involve the stakeholder, designer, researcher, and user in the design process from the day one. So you need to include them from the first day you start in the project, from the ideation phase to the requirement gathering, design, and evaluation. I truly believe in this framework and in the successful delivery of this framework, as I've seen it in real life in many applications, and it actually makes the user voice heard, especially if you are designing for special users. So let's say children with some sort of disability or learning difficulty, or you're designing for elderly, or you're designing for a special population that you as a designer are or not aware of. So let's say you're designing for a different culture, for example. You're not aware of their norm, the language they use. So participatory design comes in hand in such a situation. So the design life cycle, actually, probably people in human-computer interaction and as well as in computer science have came across the design life cycle before. It consists of 4 stages: establishing the requirement, designing, prototyping, and evaluation. This is an iterative process. It actually iterates between the establishing the requirement and designing, as well as designing and prototyping. So for example, you design a prototype, you take it to the user, they dislike some parts of it, so you go back and design it. And so it's a very iterative process, and it's actually your decision as a designer to decide when should you stop in such a process. Basically, to reach the design stage, you would have understood the problem, have a conceptualized idea of what would be your solution. For example, I'll speak about myself and my research. So for example, we looked at basically the learning of children with autism. And we have met teachers, we have interviewed teachers, we have worked with children, with parents. We realized having a solution that is tangible is basically could have a potential. So at that stage, we have a conceptualized idea what would be a solution that could be tangible, maybe an iPad or a tangible technology that they could use everywhere, and they could share basically with their parents, with their fellow children in class, and so we have a conceptualized idea. After that, the second stage would be us establishing the requirement, establishing a formal process to collect the requirement. So we go to schools, we interview teachers, we watch students playing with the equipment they currently have, and we understand and we collect basically the requirement. Toward the end of the stage, we will have a full set of functional and non-functional requirements. So what are the requirements of the system? We then start designing. Designing basically is a process of creating prototype, following some certain design principle at the initial stage, and then involving the users to get their feedback. So at this stage, I will be discussing the design and the alternatives within the prototypes. So I will go through quickly on the design principle. As I said, the design principles, they were the first basically pieces of literature created in this field in the early 90s. And people at that stage have looked at basically guidelines to guide them when designing. Design principles, basically, they would be available either in the research by famous researchers in the field like Ben Schneiderman or Nelson, and also in practice. So if you go on Apple website or for example, you just Google the term Apple design principles, you will find a website that describes to you the Apple iOS design principle. And in fact, they have divided them to fit the different platform that they are providing. So basically, these design principles, if you look at them, you will notice that all have some certain commonalities. And today I will be covering these commonalities. For example, the first design principle we are covering today is visibility. When you design an object and there is an action needs to be performed, the action should be visible to the users. So there must be, all the functionality must be visible and known to the user. For example, on the right side, we have a very common example. In washrooms, in public washrooms, usually they have water taps with sensors. So if you have a water tap with sensor, the sensor should be clear enough for the user using the water tap. And I come across hundreds of examples where the sensor were not actually visible. And you would spend some time just looking for the sensor. And that's actually an example of a bad design. Feedback. In terms of design, when a user clicks a button, he or she is expected to see a feedback or hear a feedback to know that the action has been performed. So feedback is basically an indication that the action has been performed or accomplished in some way. It could be visual, audio, tactile, you name it. You could be creative in creating feedback. This is a very standard feedback. Download a message, you would get a feedback that tells you about the status of the download. In terms of additional design principle, constraint is another important design principle. So when you design an action, you need to make it visible to the user what are the actions that are visible to be done and what are the actions that are not visible. So if an action is not visible, so you should clearly indicate to the user that this action, you cannot do this action at this certain point. And actually here is on the right hand side is also a good example, again, with Apple interfaces, where the not visible or the action that the user cannot do actually highlighted in gray, while the action that the user can perform are highlighted in dark black. Consistency is another design principle, and it's actually a design principle that was influenced by marketing. So if you build a website or an app or any kind of product, consistency throughout the actions or the task performed is extremely important. For example, in Microsoft or in iOS, you would see usually the top menus are usually always similar, with similar commands and similar actions. And that provides consistency, and consistency is usually very much related to trust. So if I see an interface that is consistent, so I would trust it more. Fairness is again a very important design principle, and it actually tell us, so if I see a button, I would automatically think that I need to click it. So there should be a clue in an object, what would be the action. For example, a door, you would know when would you pull a door and when would you push a door. So the clue is very clear from the design of this product. Similarly, with such an old design, in iOS, when we see the calendar here, I don't know if some of you still remember this calendar. So basically, it is very clear for me as a user that I need to scroll down or scroll up rather than click a button. So these actions actually, or this design, it tells me as a user what action needs to be done. And similarly to the last example on the far left hand side, basically on the actions in terms of how can I turn on or turn off a button. So these actions actually are very clear and very made clear through the design of the object. And that's basically your task as a designer, is basically to design an object that the user have a clue how to operate without actually needing to read a manual or a set of instruction or having instruction from a certain a more experienced user. Please, if you have some questions, you could share your questions with us on the right-hand side pane of the screen. Another important terminology in user interface design, as well as human-computer interaction, are personas and user journeys. Again, they are influenced by the field of marketing, and it's actually very much common in marketing, and we see it used in big firms and so. So to design a user journey, you would need to know your actor or the user, or we could call it a persona, and the action. So on the right-hand side, we have a user journey that is actually a template of a user journey. So in the user journey, for example, on zone B, you would draw the user experience. So what would a user do when he first operates an app or a website or a product until the fulfilling his or her goal? So you basically draw the whole experience. Following that, you will, as a designer with the design team, you will look at basically zone C, where you will define what are the opportunity for you as a designer of the technology, who owns each action. And in zone A, which is the initial zone, you will create your scenario. What are the goals and the expectations of the user for you to fulfill these goals in designing the user journey at zone B, which is the experience, and then discussing the experience with the user themselves, as well as the stakeholder in the zone C. To design a user journey, you have to have a persona in mind. What do we mean by persona? Persona is a fictional character that you as a design team with the user that would come up with. It has a rich description of a typical user, and that will guide you as a designer to know the expectation of this typical user, what he would want, what are his goals, what might frustrate him or her, and so. So here is an example of a persona from one of my students' projects, actually, in eHealth. So the project was looking at developing an app for eHealth and diabetes. And the student and his group basically were working into looking at controlling type 2 diabetes with the users. So they created these nice personas in collaborations with the user. And in this persona, as you could see, there is the bio that describes the user. Of course, this is a fictional character, it's not a real character. The main health needs and goal and the frustration, and these personas are generated after meeting the number of users and creating a common understanding of the user they would be designing for. And it's a good guiding way for you during the design. Usually a good persona helps us as designer to understand whether a particular design decision will help or hinder the user. Prototyping, on the other hand, is actually a method for us to test our ideas. A prototype could range from a very simple sketch prototype to a semi-operating system, let's say. So it either could be a series of screen or sketches, a storyboard, or a cartoon-like series of scenes, as simple as a PowerPoint show, video simulation, lump of wood, as in the famous Palm Pilot prototyped their first product as a simple lump of wood, a cardboard mock-up, a piece of software with a limited functionality, as I said, so you could test some of the functionality you have developed. So here is some examples of real life prototypes. It could be a lump of wood, just for you to give an idea of the stakeholders of the user, what would you be designing, or it could be a sketch using a pen and paper, or a wireframe using a specialized software. So what, how, and why to prototype? So what to prototype? Usually we prototype technical issues, flows, some screen layouts to just make sure that the user is comfortable with this layout, some difficult or critical areas, and how to prototype. Usually we prototype either by, as I said, sketching or so, or we could prototype with specialized softwares. So you might start by a simple paper-based mockup. Why to prototype? To evaluate, as I said, a product. Make sure that the stakeholders are basically satisfied, and that's actually very common in industry. So you ask a company to build a website for you, and then they will show you with a set of wireframes to make sure you're happy with it, before them going and spending time and money developing the back end. It's a way to give all the team members of the design a common picture of the project. It's a way to test new ideas and to encourage reflection about a current design. So prototypes are meant to answer your questions, support you as a designer between alternative solutions. There are two types of prototypes. The low-fidelity prototype, in which you use a very basic medium, such as paper, cardboard, and so. It's quick and cheap. It is not meant to be integrated to your final product, of course. Some examples could be sketches of screen, task sequences, post-it notes, storyboards, Wizard of Oz approach that I will be introducing. So this is an example of a storyboard. You can see the designer. Most probably he's not very good in art, but he managed to communicate his ideas. Another is the cardboard approach of prototyping that you could show the end user or the stakeholder the flow of the screens. Sketches is another example. The Wizard of Oz approach, in which you have at figure A, you can see a user drawing something on the tablet. So you have the end part, the user end part of your software fully developed. However, the back end is not developed at all. So you have someone actually in the back end responding to the user instead of the user, basically of the system responding to the user, and that's called the Wizard of Oz approach, and it's actually very famous in the area of human-computer interaction. It's used in many contexts, and it actually allows us to basically, especially if we want to examine a very innovative and new idea, and basically prototyping it might take time, fully designing it might take time. Therefore, we would prototype it using a Wizard of Oz approach, where we have the end product fully ready without any processing in the back end. We would have a person instead of the processor to perform the tasks. A high fidelity prototype, on the other hand, is basically a product that is very close to your final product. And it can be developed by integrating certain softwares to just show an idea. It is a very useful way to sell a product, and that's when we pitch an idea to a stakeholder or basically a funding agency. We might have a high fidelity prototype to pitch the idea. It might be dangerous because the user might expect that this is the final product. This is not the final product. It's just a final prototype that looks very similar to the final product. Here we have an example of a low fidelity prototype on the left-hand side and a high fidelity prototype on the right-hand side. And you could see the difference. The high fidelity prototype looks like a full prototype. However, it is not. There is nothing on the back end. However, this is only a series of screens to give the end user a feel that he or she is using the real system. Participatory design is, as I said, a very common approach nowadays in design, and it's actually gaining a lot of interest in research, and people are trying to use it with different special groups for us to understand their needs. So it is known as cooperative design as well. As I said, it has a political background. It originated in Scandinavia to support the labor movement, and that's by saying that they wanted the labor to have a say in the product development. And there where this process started. It could be used for a variety of fields, from software engineering to urban design and architect to graphic design. Even in medicine, it has been used. And you would find, if you search for papers of participatory design in medicine, you would find a lot of interesting work. It is basically a process of democratizing the innovation. So you have the users, the end user, the stakeholders, basically voice is heard throughout the process. It consists of sessions where you apply design techniques with the users. So you give the user the ability to create and design the mock-up themselves. So you would need firstly to train the users before them going into the design session. You would ask them to explain their design idea, and that will give them an understanding of what they really want. Here is actually an interesting project that we have taken forward with our colleagues at QCRI. Myself and my students were here presenting a participatory design session at Hamad Medical Cooperation, Nursing Informatics. This session took place, actually it was a series of sessions that took place in early 2019 to design a product that nursing community will facilitate in their daily work. So here are some basically storyboards, some user journey that they have developed. And we are now actually, me and Dr. Kamran, as well as other faculty members and a researcher in QCRI, writing an interesting paper about it, about how we applied participatory design for the first time in Qatar, in the Middle East actually, in a medical or a healthcare sector. The final slide that I would like to cover today is basically, I would like to shed the light on designing for vulnerable population. By vulnerable population, I mean children, persons with disability, persons with learning difficulties, elderly, and more. So when we design for these population, a question that might raise is the techniques we are used to using and employing in design are valid when using with those special population? This is a question to be asked in research, in fact, and many have been basically experimenting participatory design, storyboard, cardboard with these different groups to know, is it valid or should we alter these approaches? The idea of designing for all have started in the late 90s by Ronald Mace, where he basically promoted for designing for all. So basically, instead of designing for people without disabilities, we need to look at the bigger picture and design for all, for children, people with disability, people with learning disability, you name it, people with different ethnicities and background and so. Another basically important scholar who called upon this approach is Ben Schneiderman, who defined the terminology universal usability. Nowadays in research, there are more frameworks coming out that basically promote to this idea. So there is the framework of ability-based design. So you analyze first the ability of the user before designing. Design for user empowerment. So designing in a way that you empower the user. In practice, there is the famous WCAG guidelines, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines by W3C, and it's very famously acknowledged. Actually, it turned to a law and policies in many countries, and these are simple design guidelines to guide the design of web content and the accessibility for web content. Qatar e-accessibility policy was established in 2011, something I'm very proud of in Qatar, and now MEDA's digital accessibility services is taking over to ensure the accessibility of the design of websites and products when it comes to the government and semi-government entities. In the light of the crisis of COVID-19, as we are going through this crisis, many organizations have highlighted the importance of accessibility and accessible design of digital information products and services made available to the public, and the ITU, which is the International Telecommunication Union, established basically their design guidelines in this crisis to make sure that the design is accessible to all. So by this, I conclude my speech for today, and I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Kamran Khawaja. Just my last message: design is very important. Please look into the process and see how can you apply some of these theories that I have presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina. Before we start, let me quickly share my screen. Good morning, everyone, to all the attendees for attending. As Dr. Dina already highlighted in the start of the presentation today, that evaluation also is a part of the design cycle. So it plays a very important role. So in this part of the remaining session, we'll be talking about what exactly is the evaluation, how to do it, where to do it, and what exactly are the methods. But before we proceed further, I would like to actually show you a few examples of why do we actually need to do an evaluation. If we don't do it, what exactly can happen? Now, today, many people are actually working on the smart homes and smart city solutions. And you know that when it's a part of the smart home, you may want to actually control all the equipment, home appliances from your smartphones and so on. So this shows a very simple example of our stoves. And now you can actually see that it's a typical example of switches and the stoves, burners and the switches. So in the first part, you can actually see that there are actually 4 burners and there are 4 switches, but they are actually aligned in a different way. So you may actually get confused how exactly is the mapping working. Are these 2 leftmost in the first column, the burners are actually related to the leftmost 2 switches, or the first 2 in the first row are actually related to the first 2 switches? Similarly, the same is the case with the second picture. You can see that the representation of the switches is slightly different. However, the user can still get confused. How exactly is the mapping working? Now, are these first 2 switches related to the first 2 burners in the first row, or are they related to the first 2 burners in the first column? However, the intuitive solution would have been much better if the solution would have been designed in a way that, as shown in the slide, in the left rightmost part in the C figure. So we can actually see that the layout is more intuitive, and the user can actually see that how each switch is actually connected to which burner. So the leftmost burner is related to the leftmost switch. So is on the case with the rightmost burner and the rightmost switch. Another example from the home appliances is basically we use our electricity on a regular basis. Now we can actually see that this shows an example of the lights. So if you want to actually control the electricity and the lights from your smart home appliance, smartphones, so we have different representation of the buttons as well as the lights. So we go from the bottom up. So in the part C, we can actually see there are 8 lights, and they are actually divided into 4x2 rows and columns. Now the issue is when you see the buttons, but there are 2 buttons, 2x2 row of the buttons. So which button is related to which tube light is actually very difficult for you to understand unless you have a smart mapping. So the leftmost, the topmost button could be related to the first 2 lights in the first row, or they could be related to the first 2 lights in the first column. Similarly, if you actually move up, if you go in the figure B, we have the 4 lights and the 4 buttons. Now again, it's a confusion. Which button is related to which light is actually difficult unless you do a hit and try method. So it can be sometimes very frustrating for you to actually control. So the intuitive design would be more as we can actually see in the figure A, where we have 4 lights and the 4 buttons, and all are aligned in the same way. So if the representation of the light is horizontal, we have the buttons in the horizontal. If the alignment of the lights were vertical, we could actually align the buttons vertically so that user knows without any hit and try method how to actually operate the buttons. Now these are more related to the hardware, but if we come to the software, we use a lot of applications. Now this is a very simplest kind of a dialog screen where we are actually specifying the username and the password. Now, the interesting thing that you actually know that the labels are typically uneditable. However, if you see this dialog, you actually see 4 different text fields. So first, you see the username, and then you see another on the right-hand side, and then you see the password, and then you see another text field on the right-hand side. Now, by right, when you have the labels, they are uneditable, and you know by the look and feel. However, from the text field, you already know that it's actually a text field. How do you know that the username is also a text field? Because you can see a cursor. So when you see a cursor, it actually gives you an impression that are you going to specify the username in here, or is it working as a label? By right, it is actually a label, but someone has actually created label as a text field. So it actually gives a different feeling to the user, and we should not actually do it. So this shows an example of what exactly can be a problem. So we should try to actually simplify the user interfaces to the way that it's not difficult for a user to understand. Without doing a hit and try method, they can easily use the interface. If they get frustrated, they might stop using it. If they stop using it, then there is no point for us to actually develop the solution. So this is where actually the use of the evaluation comes in. We have already seen that the user evaluation is actually part of the integral design process. It can actually happen throughout the design lifecycle. It can be happening in a recursive manner during design, or it can also happen once the product is finished. So we can actually divide it into the formative evaluation and the summative evaluation. Summative evaluation is when the product has actually finished, the final product, and then you do the evaluation. However, for the formative evaluation, it can actually happen during the different life cycles. So there are different actually methods that can be actually used to conduct an evaluation. Now, as far as these evaluations are concerned, there are 3 different ways in which the evaluation can be conducted. Now, we can actually bring the users to us and do the evaluations, or we could go to their own environment and we can do the evaluation. And lastly, we do not involve the user. So basically, the first 2 settings are the ones where we actually involve the users, and the last one is related to the setting where we do not involve the users, but we use the researchers or an expert as a user because they have the background knowledge of the domain. Now, the first one is basically the control setting, which actually typically happens in the lab environment. So main methods that we can actually use includes the experiments, we conduct observations, we conduct interviews, and do a lot of questionnaires so that we understand how the system is actually working in order to actually meet the requirement of the users. So the reason why we basically bring the users to our control setting or the lab-based environment is that there is no outside influence to the user, and they are very much focused on what they need to do in the system. And then we can actually understand how their mind is working and how they're interacting with the system without any disturbance. This approach is basically successfully used to evaluate a lot of applications on the PCs, laptop, even on the mobile phones. So let me give you an example of it. So here we can actually see two different settings. The first one is a customized lab environment where the user, you can see the user is actually using the system, and the observers are actually observing them from the back scenes. So, and the researcher could be actually helping the user just in case there is an issue. However, so we can see that there is no distraction to the user. They are using the system without any outside influence. Sometimes if the usability is not possible in our settings, so what we can basically do is we can actually use a portable lab and equipment. So that can actually include everything from you having the laptop to the smartphones to the cameras. The reason why we actually install the camera is we want to actually see how exactly is the user actually working on the system, which screen is actually used at, how they are moving the mouse, what exactly are the emotions, and how exactly are they working, how much time are they actually using on each screen, and so on, so that we do not miss any part of the for the evaluation. So even for the set of the for using the smartphones, you can actually see that there is a camera which is actually mounted on top of the smartphone, and the event, whatever interaction is happening on the screen, can be easily actually recorded. So this is this actually shows two different versions of how we can actually conduct the evaluation in the control setting. However, there is another setting that we can actually go to the users to conduct the evaluation, and that is what we call a natural setting. Now, this is basically used to gather a lot of design requirements, and this actually influence to how we can actually improve the solutions and the technology. Because when we go to and meet the users in their own environment, we can see what exactly are the issues and how exactly are they working. And similarly, as I showed you in the control setting environment, everything that we do is actually recorded so that we do not miss any point. Now, the last setting is basically the one where we do not involve the users. So now the question is, whom do we involve? And as I mentioned to you earlier, that we actually use the experts or the researchers as a base to actually understand the role of the users. So there are different methods which are actually used, and some of these methods can be inspection methods where the use of the heuristic evaluation is used, or we use the cognitive walkthroughs, or we also do some sort of analytics, some measuring and collecting, analyzing all the reports, and we also do some sort of modeling. So this is a place where we use the experts, because sometimes gathering the users is very time consuming. Imagine you are developing a solution for the medical doctors. Imagine the situation in the COVID. If you want to actually COVID-19, and if you want to book an appointment for your own regular consultancy, you have to wait a lot of time. So imagine if you are to actually develop an application for those doctors, it's very difficult for you to actually get those hands-on to those real users. So sometimes you want to actually simulate it. So this is where the use of the experts come in, that you use the expertise of the domain to actually gather the requirements, or even use the existing solution that you have been actually working on, or design solutions, so that you can actually improve them before you start to actually deploy them. So we already know a lot about the control settings where the users are actually used. Let me give you an example of how we can actually use the experts to actually conduct an evaluation. Because we always work as a users, but we do not know how the experts actually work. So one of the technique that the experts is commonly used, is like the heuristic evaluation, which was developed by the Jacob Nielsen and the Molish. They actually developed the set of 10 heuristics which are actually the general design principles for the interaction design. Now, the reason why they are actually called the heuristic is they are broad set of the rules of thumbs rather than they are specific usability guidelines. Now, they actually went through a couple of revisions before they actually published a final set. So lastly, basically the Nelson revised the set of the 10 heuristic based on the 249 usability problems gathered through a lot of experimental evaluations. Now, these actually, the heuristics are actually kind of generic, and researchers have been actually adapting them for their own customized environment. For instance, you can actually find these heuristic for the evaluation of the mobile devices, wearable solutions, the health solutions, even for the games, even for the autism spectrum disorder, for the augmented reality, virtual reality, and so on. As a part of our previous research work, we also have developed a set of the heuristic for the autism spectrum disorder. Now, people actually use those design guidelines as a basis to actually develop the heuristics. We are not going to talk about how to actually develop the heuristics, but we are going to taking an example of how we can use the heuristics to do an evaluation of any interface. Now, on the left-hand side, we can actually see a set of 10 heuristics which are developed by the Nelson itself. So these are all the 10 heuristics, starting from the visibility of the system status to the helping the users recognize, diagnose, and recover from the errors, and the help and documentation. So the question, as we always ask, is how many experts do we need to conduct an evaluation? So on the right hand side, we can see a graph, and that this graph actually shows that this graph has been actually generated from a lot of experimental evaluation of these studies where the experts were actually involved, and we can actually see that almost between 3 to 5 experts, you can actually gather almost 75% of the usability problems in the system. However, as you go further, if you even involve the number of experts increase, the line is going to get straight, so it's not going to improve further. So as per the research, you can actually use a minimal of 3 to 5 experts as a base to identify the issues, what sort of issues exist in the interface, and how we can actually improve it. So what we basically do is we let the users use an interface. We ask them to actually go through an interface, and we ask them to identify what sort of problems would they actually feel if they were actually considering themselves as a user. So whenever they find any problem, we ask them to write the problem, describe the problem in detail so that the designers can actually understand it. So once they have written the description of the problem, we also ask them to write down a possible recommended solution from their own perspective, because they are the one who are facing the problem. So we want to actually hear their voice. So we ask them to actually describe the potential solution. And then we ask them to categorize the severity of the problem. Now, these problems can be actually categorized from the scale of 0 to 4. So 0 means it's not a problem. Basically, the first is a cosmetic problem. It's a very minor thing to do it. It's a very slight change to actually do it. And then we have the minor, we have the major, and then we have the catastrophe. Now, these basically problems are identified with respect to all the heuristics that we have in the set, which means we have the 10 set of the heuristic. This is just to show you an example. Now, one of the heuristic is basically Nelson's heuristic is match between the system and the real world, which actually means that we should be using the similar terminologies from the real world. So from the left hand side, we can see that there is a Facebook screen. Someone is trying to update the status, and there you can see a check-in. Now, this concept of the check-in is exactly the same concept that we see in the real world. If you were actually using a different terminology, people would get confused. So this is an example of the match between the system and the real world. Another one is basically the user control and the freedom. So on the right hand side, we can see an example of the Gmail interface, where assuming that if you have actually deleted anything, or if you have actually sent anything, and if you want to actually undo it, you actually mistakenly deleted it. So you need actually a freedom to actually control it. If you do not have any undo button, assuming that you mistakenly deleted any message and you do not have any undo button in it, so you can assume the frustration of the user. Another is a consistency in the standard. You can see that the design of the buttons on the left side screen is actually similar. So the force stop, the clear button, clear data, and the uninstall, they all look the same. So it is important that the consistency is actually followed throughout the application. So another one, the example is the error prevention. We want to actually prevent the errors in the system, and it's basically in order to prevent the errors, it's better to we actually have the precautions. And how we can do a precautions? We actually do a confirmation whether the user really wants to actually delete it, for instance, instead of mistakenly or unintentionally pressing the delete button and message gets deleted. So it's always important that we have the confirmation dialog boxes. And then we have the on the symbol left hand side, we can actually see an example of the aesthetic and a minimalistic design, which actually means that it only is doing things related to one specific task. So on the left hand side, we can see a sign-in screen of the Google, and it's very simple and very minimal. It is actually doing a single task, which is actually the sign-in. You do not see anything else. However, you do have an option to go back to some other options, to go back to some other screens, for instance. However, it's only doing a minimal thing. And another example is let the users understand and diagnose and recover from the errors. Not actually, we always come across a lot of errors. It's very important for us to actually guide the users and let the user understand why this error actually occurred and how to actually recover from it if the same error occurs in the future. So the best thing to do is basically not only giving an error message, but we also give them suggestions of how we can actually overcome, where they can actually find out more information about how to overcome those messages in the future. So these all things are related to, examples are related to the heuristic evaluation, and they are typically conducted by the experts instead of involving the users. And we can actually see that if we do not do a evaluation on a regular basis, and by the time it's actually we have the end system, it is very difficult for us to go back, and it's a very time consuming. So it's very important for us as a design, as a part of the design life cycle, we conduct the evaluations on a regular basis with the users. If the users are, if it's very time consuming for us to have the whole hands-on on the users, we should actually go for the experts as an alternate to go for the evaluation. So with this, I will actually conclude my part of the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to actually ask in the question and answer. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamran. Very interesting talk, and actually it shows the importance of basically including the users and as well as in the expert. As you said, if there is an issue with actually basically getting the users, one approach is basically to look at is actually consulting expert. As you said, it's a very it's a very established approach in research, which is heuristic evaluation. It has been there since the early 90s, and people are still working basically in advancing it. For example, as you said, the work you've been leading on ASD, autism heuristic evaluation. We also have been working into e-health or mHealth heuristic evaluation. So now I will go to the questions that we have received from the audience. Thank you very much, everyone, for basically putting some question forward that we could address. So one question says, basically, we go to the question and answer pane. So in some cases, reaching the user is hard. For example, if you are planning to launch a product for mass users, e.g. the next version or the next generation of iPhones, a question would be, how can you capture and interact with a large set of users? So I think the question the answer could be divided by myself and Dr. Kamran. So from my own perspective, what I see, usually big companies like iPhone, like Apple, I mean, or Google or Microsoft, they have focus groups with users, and they do this practice very common. And in fact, also here in Qatar, like huge telco companies and other companies that develop software, they would have a focus group with users that they would reach out to and and pose such questions to. And actually myself, I have raised this question to Google in terms of accessibility or designing for the blind, and I received an answer that they work closely with focus groups of people with disability before launching the product. So they have a representative sample of the population they are designing for. I will ask Dr. Kamran to give his point of view in this question.
Yeah, so these all the giant companies, they also have, as we mentioned as part of the design, we can actually use the users as well as the experts. So they have the huge bank of the existing users which they actually have been using. If they can actually do an advertisement to gather the users, or on the contrary, they also manage a bank of the users, as the Dr. Dina mentioned, that they have communication with the telcos and so on. So they can use the set of the bank of the users for the sake of the evaluation or for the launch of any solution which they are actually doing. On the contrary, they can also might be having an in-house expert, so they can actually hire the experts for the same to actually do the simulation. Because, for instance, in an ongoing situations, where crisis, where we are unable to actually reach out to the user, so we can actually conduct all those evaluations online, where we can actually do a simulations, where we can show the interfaces to the users, and we can actually let them users to actually use it, and then we can gather all the requirements. So nowadays, because with the technology we can do anything, it's just the matter of the imagination of to what extent do we want to actually go. So it's basically using the bank of the evaluation and the bank of the users and bank of the experts for the sake of the evaluation.
So basically, the take-home message is basically there is always a trade-off. So you have basically the user-centered design and the expert evaluation. There is always a trade-off, and there is always a case where one approach is better and more suitable. So as Dr. Kamran said, now with the crisis, you cannot really reach the user face-to-face. You could only reach remotely. However, you could make use of expert evaluation, and actually sometimes issues found by expert might not be found by normal users. So sometimes a combination of such an approach is the best way forward. So user evaluation as well as an expert evaluation, and we've seen this in many products and many successful products worldwide, and even in research, in our own research, we would sometimes combine these methodologies to get the best product. So by this, I would like to conclude the session. I would like to thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you for your active participation and for the question you've raised. And I hope we have addressed these questions. And we will see you, inshallah, soon, maybe face-to-face, maybe on a webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Kamran. And I'm concluding the session.